So this video is about Jendrassik maneuvers, and a Jendrassik maneuver is something that you would use when you're doing a deep tendon reflex. Deep tendon reflex meaning something like a bicep reflex, a tricep reflex, patellar reflex. What can happen in those reflexes, if we're using the Wechsler scale of grading, Wechsler scale of grading is pretty straightforward. Pretty much it's a 0 through 5, and each number has a plus with it. So plus 5 and plus 4 are both pathological. In this case, in plus 4, we have transient clonus, and in plus 5, we have sustained clonus. And then below plus 4 and plus 5, we have ranges of normal, and all of these can be normal. So we have plus 3, which could be a little bit hyperreflexic, and we have plus 2, which means that there's joint movement and it's considered in the range of normal, though everything that you're seeing in blue is considered potentially normal. And then there's plus 1, where it's a little hyporeflexic. That's a Y over here, hyporeflexic. And then, of course, a plus 0, which is no response, which may also be normal. So everything you see in blue is potential to be normal. If you're colorblind, you're looking at plus 3 through plus 0, all potentially normal. Big red flag up here. Plus 5, plus 4, these are never considered normal. We would use a Jendrassik maneuver when we have a problem with a deep tendon reflex only when we get a 0 plus. 0 plus or plus 0, no response. And that's where we add the Jendrassik. So the Jendrassik for some people would be someone asking the patient to move their arm or turn their head or clench their fist or push their feet together. And there's lots of different options in what you can do for a Jendrassik maneuver. I prefer just to have the patient clench their jaw. And the reason is that when we move our arms and legs and we turn our head, we start to invoke some of the cross-chord reflexes, the gait reflexes, etc., that can bring a reflex back around, but perhaps not in the way optimally that you want to do that. So I use a jaw clench, and so the way this is performed is that I've tapped the tendon, let's say the bicep tendon. I've got a plus 0 or 0 plus, no response. I'm going to be ready to go. That's the real key right there. Ready to go when I do the next tap, and I'm going to ask the patient to clench their jaw, clench their teeth, and tap immediately. That's probably the most important thing. You're ready to do the reflex, you have them clench, and you tap immediately to get the Jendrassik response. And if in fact now you had a plus 0 and you've elicited something different, let's say after the Jendrassik maneuver this time the reflex was a little hyper, the way you would record that then is it was plus 0. Now we're going to record that as plus 3J. We include the J in our recording of the rating of the Wechsler scale to let us know that you used a Jendrassik maneuver to elicit it. If you had a 0 plus to start, you used the Jendrassik maneuver and you still had no response, that would be recorded as a plus 0J. Again, noting that the J is there. You don't underline the J. I'm underlining that for you. The mechanism for this is kind of cool. There's definitely some distraction involved, but it's actually more involved than just the distraction. Here's how it kind of works. I show you a spinal cord, and I've got the posterior horn, the anterior horn, the anterior horn, and the posterior horn again. And the anterior horn cells live over here, and these are the cell bodies of our lower motor neurons. these are the things that get stimulated with a sensory response. So if I put the tap in, I'm put a big S for the sensory part, it goes in the dorsal horn, it synapses, there's a little interneuron, and then we fire out the anterior horn for the motor response. The Jendrassik maneuver affects the anterior horn cells in kind of a unique way. Here's how. We know that the cord is stacked, so there's going to be another layer of anterior horns and posterior horns and another layer of anterior horn cells that are there. And then we also know there's going to be another layer of the same thing above. So we've got cord up here, and we have a posterior horn, and posterior horns, and more anterior horn cells. The big picture is that the anterior horn is actually part of the gray matter of the cord, and everything that is in the gray matter of the cord shares space. These are polysynaptic interneurons, and when we talk about an anterior horn cell, we also really should more accurately consider an anterior horn cell column, because there is nothing separating anterior horn cells from level to level. And even more significantly, these lower motor neuron cell bodies also function contiguously with cranial nerve nuclei on the same side in the brainstem. So these are little cranial nerve nuclei I'm drawing over here. These are lower motor neuron cell bodies for facial muscles and things in the head. So if I want to now have the patient clench their teeth, and this is cranial nerve 5, let's say motor nucleus for the sake of argument, I activate that cranial nerve 5 motor nucleus, but since these things are all in communication, I actually bring the entire anterior horn cell column up a little closer to threshold. And now, with these anterior horn cells closer to threshold, meaning more likely to fire, when I send that sensory response in by tapping on the tendon with the reflex hammer, the motor response out is heightened slightly because of the Jendrassik maneuver, and I am more likely to get a motor response with the muscle. So that's why we only use this if you have a +0. Then we're going to add the Jendrassik. Clench your teeth, tap right away, record the finding based on the Wechsler scale, add a J. What we're doing here is actually heightening the activation of all lower motor neuron cell bodies that exist in the central nervous system.